Good evening, comrades. Hi. Thank you for joining us for another session of the Communist Culture Club. Very pleased to have Geoff Barr with us, who's going to talk later on about Marx and the Crimean War and the Ottoman Empire. But first, we're going to have a book review by our comrade Mizan Rahman, who can't be here, unfortunately, on a Thursday night, but we've pre-recorded it. And it was a very interesting interview followed on from this. So this is Disaster Nationalism, the new book by, well, recent book by Richard Seymour, who's the ex-SWP member. I'll share that now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me again. For those that don't know, my name is Mizan. I'm an activist and a comrade from Harrow. And for this month, I will be briefly talking to you about a book called Disaster Nationalism, The Downfall of Liberal Civilization by author and broadcaster Richard Seymour. Now, the book is essentially about the rise of the far right, with the rise of people like Donald Trump and Viktor Orban taking the spotlight. Many of us think that defeating these fascist dictators will be enough. But the author argues that the true battle lies elsewhere, because defeating Trump or Orban will not do anything that will stem the tide of tide of the movement that is driving these people forward. As stated in the book, quote, "They are merely an embodiment of profound forces that are rarely understood. Propelled through the vast networks of social media and fueled by far-right influences, enthralled by images of disaster and fantasies of doom, they have emerged from a reservoir of societal despair, and within this seeking cauldron, we witness not only the surge of far-right political movements, but also the sparks of individual and collective violence against perceived enemies, from lone wolf killers to terrifying pogroms. Should a new fascism emerge, it will coalesce from these very elements. This is disaster nationalism." So according to the author, it is the link between these far-right grassroots movements and the assets of the state that result in the rise of this disaster nationalism. And this is what makes the far-right really dangerous, because instead of providing an actual solution, the author states, quote, "The far-right's preferred model of spiritual revival was the adventure of war, with millions marching towards an enlivening encounter with a disaster they could kill, excited and aroused by the prospects of death," end quote. So the thing about the various factors that gives rise to these grievances and the sense that the system isn't essentially working, which the far right can capitalize on, is that the solutions to these problems are complex. And even though the left is good at diagnosing these problems and dealing with them from a systemic point of view, the right is better at capturing people's emotions, because it speaks to those grievances directly and gives the people an enemy to focus on, whether it's immigrants, women, Muslims, Jews, or someone else. The right can take on a vocabulary that speaks to people's grievances, but misdirect their anger and energy towards an entirely innocent human face. The problem with the left is that its messaging can be very complicated, which doesn't really direct the people towards the real enemies, which are like, oligarchs, the military industrial complex, or corporate neoliberal capitalist class. Using the example of the rise of fascism in the US, UK, Hungary, India, and Israel, the author explains how the existence of these movements can help whitewash the failures of far-right political parties and mobilize the base towards an innocent enemy. So, using the example of Modi, for example, who was the governor in Gujarat in around 2002, the author explained how Modi, whose party was kind of tanking in the polls at that time, was able to use the Gujarat massacre to further consolidate his position and eventually become Prime Minister of India. To me, these far-right movements almost come across as foot soldiers or death squads who represent and protect the worst excesses of those in power. But the most important thing is that there is a part of the network that is decentralized, which means that the messaging of the far right can reach out to people who aren't connected uh, even though they're on social media, they might not be directly connected to these far right networks, but dangerously inspire far right lone wolf killers as well. And for the author, he used the example of Thomas Mayer, the killer of Joe Cox, who was obviously who had all these far right ideas, but really, really radicalized by Brexit and fear of immigrants. And this is important because this is one of the only books that I have read that really talks about the lone wolf, the people who engage in lone wolf killings from a psychological point of view. And the author's honest enough to say that everyone has within their personality some kind of authoritarian streak, and this movement, which is connected to disaster nationalism, is really authoritarian in its messaging and its actions. And this is something that the author describes as well. Like there are some parts of the working class that are authoritarian, that kind of strong man leaders, and we were kind of talking about this before, Tina, about leaders in the far left as well. But in the far right, they are very strongman, which means that they are essentially violent and very hateful. And this book kind of delves into that personality as well. So, but the thing is, the book essentially describes this network and their use of far right parties. However, it doesn't provide any solutions. This book is about the network, but these far right networks, the grassroots networks that are essentially totalitarian and authoritarianism in their nature, and how they see kind of doom and gloom everywhere, but they don't provide any solutions. And unfortunately, this book does not provide any solutions as well. So it's not a solutions orientated book. So it is up to the reader to figure out how they want to respond to the rise of the far right. For me, um, the response is essentially to not just organize, but also to be a bare anti-racist and to use all my platforms to challenge all forms of racism and hatred. So to conclude, it is a very important book for our times. It describes the links between the various far-right groups, the movements, and the state. It is a rather easy to read book, and it has a good flow, but it doesn't provide any solutions. So the solutions is really up to people like us. We have to provide better messaging that can explain the grievances that many people feel and direct them towards the real enemies of humanity. Um, and basically, we have to fill the void that the far right is trying to fill and capitalize on. Yeah, that.
Very much, comrade. Can I ask you a couple of questions then on this, and maybe we could discuss this a little bit if you have the time. I've read a couple. I've not read the book, but I've read a couple of articles and interviews he gave Richard Seymour on the issue, and I was going to start asking you, but you mentioned it yourself now. There's no solution, and I think that's also part of the problem in identifying where the problem really lies. I mean, he is right. Of course, something is happening, isn't it? There are right-wingers rising, populism rising everywhere. It strikes me that Richard perhaps has thrown out the baby with the bathwater in terms of the solution, because he used to be a member of the Socialist Workers' Party.
Yeah.
Split after the rape scandal, Martin Smith, Comrade Delta, etc. And he seems to have sort of given up a little bit on the organized left, the organized working class providing any solution. Do you get, I mean, everything I've read from him, he doesn't even mention the need for a party of the left, for example, to oppose racist, oppose populism. Did you get that impression from him that he seems to have given up?
Oh, obviously, I haven't done in terms of he himself. I haven't done that much research in terms of the author himself. I'm just reading his book. I read a few of his interview. I listened to a few of his interviews. I think, from the understanding that I got, I think he's given up on political parties, and I understand that coming from Labour now, like literally. But I don't think he's given up on grassroots movements. This book isn't for someone who is new to it, basically. I think it's someone who's new to it, who is looking for direction in regards to what they want to do. It is up for other people to maybe direct them. But for people like yourself or myself, maybe it'll be like, okay, this is the problem. He's right in one sense. These far right movements, it's not a single, there's not a single thing that will kind of, that will stop their rise, basically. There are several, they are responding to several problems. So for example, like, the actual economic problems, the financial problems, the poverty, the austerity, we need a set, the far right is capitalizing on people who have been hurt by those. So there's different strands, and I can understand why he's kind of left that open. But for him, I did sense that, like, he has kind of not given up, but he's kind of disillusioned in kind of parties, let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I think that that is sort of part of the problem with
Yeah.
his approach, I think, is that he doesn't discuss where the rise of the right really comes from. I mean, yes, economic disaster, etc. People are feeling badly and they're looking for an
Yeah.
easy answer. But why isn't the left attractive to them, in the sense of our defeats? We've had massive defeats in our history.
Yeah.
There's the not just the Soviet Union and that failure, both in terms of it was
Yeah.
never socialism in the first place, but much of the movement thought it had to defend that distortion of an attempt to establish communism and socialism.
Yeah.
But also then closer to home now, the defeat of the Corbyn movement, which has
Yeah.
really, really demoralized a lot of people. And there's no left giving an answer. There's no left, and that is part of the problem of the right rising, that the left has been
Yeah.
so thoroughly defeated, unable to discuss its failures. It's like they're continuing to do the same problems over and
Yeah.
over again.
I think a lot of people have this vision that, for example, China is a communist country. Um, they have this vision, but obviously we know it's a capitalist country. Like, literally, it's a neoliberal country in its structure, and it's very authoritarian. It's not like a communist country at all. Um, People have that vision, and they see that because, yeah, one of the things we know, like, is that a lot of people from the 60s and 70s who were communists, who were maybe liberal or leftist, kind of went to the right because they saw the downfall of these states. Um, and also, looking domestically now, forget just Jeremy Corbyn. Like, in the United States, you had people who voted for Trump and people like AOC at the same time. And that was a very interesting phenomenon, like people who voted for Rashida Tlaib and Donald Trump at the same time. And obviously, when AOC done her research, her social media research into why this phenomena happened, is that a lot of her followers, they saw people like Donald Trump and AOC in the same camp because they were kind of perceived to be anti-establishment. So there's a lot of confusion there, and I think, for me, the left, even though it does provide the solutions, is there, it's ready to go. Like I said, the messaging isn't there yet. Like, in terms of how the groups reach out to people, there isn't like a left wing populist or an influencer. Let's put it that way. There are a lot of people coming up right
George
now.
Galloway is trying to be one, isn't he?
Yeah, George, I've got my problems with George,
I don't
man.
think that works. See, I don't think the individual populist of the left, is the
He
answer.
tried to be that, but
Yeah,
also, like, I have a problem with George because, how can you go and interview Andrew Tate, man? Sorry, I can't do it. Like, I can't get down. I can't get down with that. And
if we talked about George Galloway, we'd never stop talking. Can I
yeah,
ask you a problem with I have with the definitions, perhaps, and how do you see that? The word fascism, describing Donald Trump, the AfD in Germany, etc., as fascists or proto-fascists. I do find that quite difficult coming from Germany. I know how
yeah,
fascism came into being. It was actually, capitalism turned to fascism
yeah,
consciously because of the strong working class. The Communist Party was massive in Germany. It was on the brink of revolution and doing a Russian revolution. So
yeah.
capitalism couldn't run things in the old way and had to turn to fascism
Towards Hitler, yeah,
to oppress the left.
yeah,
The left is nowhere at the moment, which is, of course, part of the problem. So I see these people as populists, right-wing populists, but they have no reason to totally disband with democracy, to
yeah,
murder communists, to murder socialists, which is fascism, and the militias on the road, etc.,
yeah,
in the streets, banning us and and clubbing us to death, etc. I think
yeah,
if we use words like fascism, that springs to mind. And should fascism actually arise ever because we are becoming stronger? We have no words to describe what's happening because Trump was already a fascist. Do you know what I mean? Is that convincing for you that he uses the word fascism when perhaps it's just right-wing populism? Not that that's not that we shouldn't oppose it and fight against, but that there is a difference between, being murdered on the streets because you're a communist, you're a socialist, a trade unionist, and Donald Trump changing legislation.
I don't think we should use the term too loosely. I think a lot of people do use that term too loosely. And the fearmonger. So I understand why some people, in the States do criticize people who use that term too loosely on people like Trump and all that kind of stuff. However, if you look at MAGA, for example, and if you study them, there are elements within it that are fascist. And I think a lot of scholars have come out and said that there are fascists. So, and there are elements in it that are very violent as well, and they will use that violence. And it already has happened. So, in the use of these kind of shooters and in the use of these kind of people who actually, so for example, one example that Richard Seymour spoke about was that guy, I forgot his name now, that guy who actually shot up some BLM demonstrations in the United States. So he was someone who was obviously radicalized by all these far right ideologies. He was connected to the far right. He saw the rise of Black Lives Matter as a threat, and obviously his response was to actually go there and gun some people down. So that violence is there. That idea that there are people within the country that are of the left and that are seen as problems, and we have to deal with them in a very violent way. That is there. Trump, I don't think he cares, to be honest with you. But I think he is galvanizing that base. That is his base, and I think he is responding to that base. Whether or not he is a fascist or not, it doesn't really matter. For me, what he is doing is a problem, and it just needs to be challenged. What he is doing is galvanizing a base which has elements that are fascist and that are violent, and I think that's a problem.
Certainly a reflection, I think, the rise of the right populism, whatever we call it, of capitalism in deep decline, isn't it? It's in deep decline generally, ideologically as well, and that that more and more people are looking for something different that's not liberal, capitalism anymore, and the right at the moment has
I think
the answers.
I think just one of the things I would say is that I think the majority of the public, they are of the opinion that anything that is against the mainstream is a good thing. Like anything that is against the mainstream media, anything that opposes the mainstream media, anything that opposes the system is inherently good because the system is bad. We have to engage with them in terms of what do you mean by anti-establishment? What are these guys' solutions? Because when he's talking about the state, when he's talking about dismantling the state, he's not talking about anti-capitalism. He's not talking about solutions that will make things better. If he's coming out with anti-immigrant rhetoric, it's the problem of these immigrants. We have to have stronger borders. We have to have military borders. Then what he's really talking about is more neoliberalism on steroids. And that's how we have to talk to them, because what he's talking about isn't providing problems, it isn't providing the solutions. What he's essentially saying is causing more problems, and that's what people don't see.
That's a really important point, and that's a really good way to sum up. Shouting fascists at people who support Trump, Farage, is not the answer. These are actually part of the working class that are disenchanted by capitalism, looking for answers, and the left just really has to get its act together and explain what we are for. What is communism? What is actually our alternative? We have such a great alternative. We just need to be brave and say it boldly. It's not the USSR. It's not even Cuba, although they have lovely weather. That's not communism. Our alternative, we have to be able to formulate it properly, how democratic, and it's based on human liberation and not imprisoning people. Thank you very much.
No problem.
That was a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to the next one. I'll definitely suggest you another book.
Thank you, Comrade Mizan. It's a shame he can't be here to discuss things in life, but he's always keen to offer new book reviews. If any of you have any books or TV shows or films you want to discuss or introduce, please get in touch. Second part of our session now. Welcome to Geoff Barr, who's proposed to look tonight at Marx, the Crimean War, and the Ottoman Empire. Not a subject that most Marxists know a lot about. So looking forward to this.
Morris was not engaged in the original war, the Crimean War. I've seen nothing on record that he said about it. Maybe he talked about it with his mates down the pub, but I don't know. Marx certainly did say a great deal about the Crimean War. And that book, rather expensive. I got it on my Kindle. It's not much read, as I think one or two people have realised. Marx's basic views didn't change between the 1850s and the 1870s. If you get that book, you've got to have some care. The editing is not up to modern standards. I had to struggle through not only that book, but comparing it with various volumes of the collected works. Not easy reading. Ah, there's a sultan for you. We don't often put sultans up here, do we? Marx was firmly behind Turkey, and the reason was straightforward. He wanted Russia defeated. He saw Russia as the main barrier to European revolution. Of course, we tend to sort of separate these things, especially if we plod through school curriculums and we discover that the Crimean War was a thing in itself. But it was only a few years after the risings of 1848. So still in everybody's mind was revolution. We mustn't forget that. Marx didn't like the Ottomans much. Here, I'll show you. He followed it closely. He followed the war and wrote mostly for the New York Tribune, which was a radical left-wing paper in New York, and for the radical British press. As soon as it happened, he got down to serious study, as you would expect of Marx, and was soon up to speed with the history, the politics of the various participants. So there we are. I've said all that, so I won't say it again. Another sultan. I'll leave you a few seconds to read what's said there, what he really thought of Turkey.
Geoff, why don't you read it out? Because there's some comrades who probably can't read the text. It's not very large.
Oh, right. Yeah, Turkey is the living sore of European legitimacy, the impotence of legitimate monarchical government. Ever since the first French Revolution has resumed itself in one axiom: keep up the status quo, a testimonium pauperatis, an acknowledgement of universal incompetence of the ruling powers for any purpose of progress or civilization, is seen in this universal agreement to stick to things as by chance or accident they happen to be. So he's saying that Turkey is essentially a bankrupt conservative state, and I think that's the consensus of historians. That's just the source. Marx was with the working class movement. The great mass of workers were firmly behind Turkey and against Russia. They saw Russia as the oppressor of Europe, especially of Poland, and they wanted to oppose Russia. Feige's, who's the note I sent out, a very competent history of the period. We need a Tsar as well as a sultan. Marx was quite clear. He wanted Russia defeated, the Tsarist regime crushed, and revolution on the way. The trouble was that the people in command, the British government and the French government principally, even some minor states, and of course the Turkish, didn't really want to destroy the Russian regime. As I've said here, they wanted to clip the Tsar's wings, not roast him for dinner. Marx's writing ceaselessly attacks the feebleness of the government's response, of French government's response. They weren't doing their job properly, he screamed. But it did take him to odd places. That's Lord Palmerston, by the way. You can see I've got an enthusiasm for aristocratic pictures. It won't last. His attacks on Lord Palmerston were ferocious. That's David Urquhart, one of history's weirdos, who for a short time was an MP, officially independent but close to the Tories. Marx had read him and described him as a monomaniac pro-Turk, a weird figure if ever there was one. Urquhart's big theory was that Palmerston was in the pay of the Russians. Marx took it up and echoed it and shouted it around. But as I say, we're still waiting for evidence, and even Marx's most sympathetic biographers have never found that evidence. If you do, you will be quite somebody. But he met the man, and he then described him as a maniac. But Urquhart ran a number of papers, the Sheffield Free Press in particular, and Marx wrote for those papers. That's Fred. And what I've said there is that the case against Turkey rested on its treatment of the non-Muslim population. And Marx used the argument that Fred developed in 1848. That was that most of the Slavic peoples, the Poles were a definite exception, were non-historic peoples and therefore doomed to be swept away in revolution. I don't think any of us will support that view. What Marx and Engels didn't know, and I recently investigated and discovered, was the vigor of the Bulgarian radical movement. These were liberal revolutionaries who were trying to free themselves of Turkey and set up the kind of state that was being fought for over most of Europe in 1848. Whoops. Well, we do need some action, don't we? I'm not going to go into the details of the Crimean War. That's not been the main focus of my interest, and I think none of you really want to hear it anyway. But Marx and Engels, followed it bit by bit. Engels wrote a lot on the military matters especially, but Marx did also. Marx wrote endlessly on the politics of the thing and on the political and diplomatic manoeuvres. They followed it in great detail with great knowledge. What a lot of people don't pick up is that the war extended into the Baltic. I've got you there a picture of the Baltic side of the operation. The idea was to attack St. Petersburg. They never quite got to St. Petersburg, but the action certainly spread well beyond Crimea. The war ended in negotiation in which Russia, on the whole, lost, not entirely. All sorts of changes took place, but there was a rerun in the 1870s, but unlike Marx and France, it was not a farce. conflict broke out across the Ottoman Empire, which was huge but decaying. As far as Palestine, most of the battles between Christians and Muslims, the funny ones that still continue today, are between Christians and Christians. Of course, each year in Bethlehem, the Orthodox and the Catholics battle it out, to the amusement of most atheists, I think. In the West, in the 1870s, massacres of Christians in Bulgaria became headline news. And there is Gladstone for you. The school history I picked up was that Gladstone was the great leader of this great crusade in defense of Christian Bulgaria against the barbaric Turks. In fact, he was rather reluctant. He was known in the title of one of the books about him as the reluctant icon. He was the figurehead. He ran a massive public meeting at Blackheath with a 5-figure number of people present. Remember, there are no microphones. But he wasn't very keen on running this campaign, and he was dragged into it by more radical liberals. Ah, there's those blokes again. And again, Marx supported the Turks. Morris, having said nothing in the 1850s that's been recorded, was stirred by the oppression of the Bulgarians. And he moved as a radical liberal. He wrote a long letter to the Daily News, which was a liberal paper of the day, urging support for the Christians and urging Britain not to take active war. We may come back to that. Marx was still looking for defeat for Russia. Morris was one of the members of a thing called the Eastern Question Association, which very few people in history remember. He was a very rich man. And what do you do with rich men when they join organizations? Well, you make them treasurer. It's the obvious thing to do, isn't it? And he became, for the first time, involved in working class movements. The London Trades Council bodies and bodies like that were throwing themselves behind the Bulgarians, and Morris was suddenly addressing working class meetings, writing songs for and slogans for working class meetings, and putting his own money in it. Marx was working rather more discreetly on the other side. So what do we have? Marx backing Disraeli seems an unlikely proposition. Morris working with Gladstone, the ultra-capitalist. What a pair. There's Disraeli. I've said there, each side was a combination of everybody from radical leftists to boneheaded reactionaries. Disraeli was one of the few reactionaries who was not boneheaded, of course. Both sides held mass meetings. There was a fair amount of violence. Things were generally livelier in those days than they had been in the post-war years. Gradually, the Disraeli pro-Turkish side won, and the Bulgarian side had to stop running meetings because they kept getting beaten up. Walter Crane is always worth looking at. Now, you've got a song. I will invite you to sing it. I will not lead the singing. You've probably seen or heard the phrase jingoism, an intense British nationalism, rabid patriotism, if you like. Ah, there's a pair of heroes for us. So what do we know about this for today? And I think this is where perhaps most of the discussion will appear. Like then, we find ourselves indirectly engaged. The working class is not the leading force on either side of the Brexit battle. It was between two groups who both represented different parts of capital. And whichever side we took, we were aligning ourselves with one side or other of capital. So in that sense, it ain't our war. But in those situations, and of course the crucial one we'll be coming on to in a second, is Ukraine. What criteria do we apply when we're picking a side? A bit of warmongering. The key criterion Marx used was which would open the way to European revolution. And that's why he was so firmly on Turkey's side. He hoped for the destruction of the Russian Tsarism, and that with Tsarism out of the way, the revolutionary fervour that was temporarily latent in the rest of Europe would open up and revolution would appear. And of course, in the 1870s, it was not long after the Paris Commune. So in both of these events, we were fairly close to revolution. Most people could remember revolutions. Morris had a different approach. He was concerned about the movement of people in the Balkans. He was concerned about the working class at home, and this introduction to the working class movement at home was a revelation to him. I do like these cartoons of Gladstone doing a jig. It seems most unlikely. Who was right? Well, in a sense, neither was. Russia was put back, but no revolution happened. Morris found the limits of support for Eastern Europe, and one of the big things he learned on his evolution towards socialism was the hypocrisy of the liberals, and in particular the liberal radicals, and that gradually moved him over a few years towards socialism. There's a stout chap. I would suggest the best criterion is simply what encourages the rising movement against capital. At home, the movement for the Bulgarians was favouring an active movement against the Tory government, whereas the movement in support of Turkey was alongside the Tory government of Disraeli. Abroad, fighting capital meant favouring a growing liberal revolutionary movement against reaction. In this case, the reaction was the Turkish Empire. By that standard, I judge Morris to have done better than Marx. Morris was an infinitely less sophisticated thinker than Marx, massively so. He came from a very different background and was feeling his way. But I think that on that he got it right. A happy couple. At home, our government favours Ukraine against Russia. No doubt about it. We've seen our beloved leader running around trying to cobble together an armed force which would stand there in favour of peace and love, but might have nuclear weapons behind it just in case. The snag is that they're both pretty bad, but Russia's surely the more reactionary state. What offers the best way forward for the labour movement and to help develop socialist consciousness, which I think we can all agree is at a pathetically low level. Ukraine seems less authoritarian, not a democracy in the sense that we've been used to, but less authoritarian than Putin. And there is an elemental social movement in Ukraine, and I've put there the link that you can go and have a look, and I think you'll find my judgment of them was that they were left-wing reformists. But I would say denouncing groups like that as just proxies, as Weekly Worker does from time to time, or puppets, or something like that, is quite wrong. They're offering an independent working class movement, and that should be encouraged. I think a Ukrainian victory by that basis is better than a Russian victory. A Ukrainian victory would certainly destabilize Putin. What could come of the destabilization of Putin? I think very few people know. A highly secretive regime. Would it mean a new Putin stepping in the way that Mugabe was replaced by a new equally reactionary regime in Zimbabwe? Would it open the way for a working class movement to reassert itself? We cannot know, frankly. The last elections in Ukraine were broadly democratic in a way that the Russian ones certainly were not. The liberal servant of the people won, but not with an overall majority. The pro-Russian opposition platform came second. It's been banned during the war, which is hardly a surprise. You fight a war, you don't expect to encourage people to campaign on the other side. Even Britain banned the fascists during World War II. And a party that seems centrist, one thing has to be said, Ukraine is deeply corrupt. There's no doubt of that. The Ukrainian government itself has admitted it from time to time. Probably even more corrupt than the British government, frankly, but certainly more freedom of expression than in Russia. There are armed fascists, part of the armed forces. They are a problem, but to call that regime fascism is absurd. Well, I'll leave it there, and I hope I've stirred you up a bit.
I'd say. Could you stop screen sharing, please, comrade?
Yep, I will end the show, and that should reveal my main screen and enable me to stop screen sharing. Where are we?
Comrades, if you want to come in, ask a question, make a comment.
Stop sharing. Here we go. I've stopped.
Please click raise hand. Well, you snuck that in, didn't you, about Ukraine and Russia? Didn't tell me you're going to speak about that.
I didn't tell you about William Morris either, did I?
Did not. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that we've got a few people disagreeing wildly in the chat.
I'm shocked.
You are shocked.
I couldn't imagine it.
I'll ask you a couple of questions on trying to bring it back to the Crimean War, which is actually quite interesting. And it's obviously, you know, you're allowed to draw conclusions or to draw comparisons with today. But, you know, looking at the situation in that war, and Marx expecting that the European Revolution could be revived by that particular war and by the defeat of Russia, which, as you said quite rightly, Russia was seen at the time, not just by Marx, but more widely as well, as the bulwark of reaction in Europe, wasn't it? It was the socialist movement saw Russia holding back the European Revolution, which had a few years before swept across Europe and then was unfortunately defeated. But there was a certain, I think there was it was understandable perhaps that Marx looked at Russia and the Ottoman Empire, I mean both reactionary regimes, and thought, well, Russia is the bigger enemy globally today. It's the rising power. The Ottoman Empire is going down the pan. Russia is coming up, and it's, if that would win, it would be worse for us. And so the defeat of Russia would put us, the working class, in a stronger view. It was kind of understandable then, Russia being the main threat. But if you look at today, I think it's quite a different situation. I mean, Russia, is that really the biggest threat still to the working class internationally? Or is it, the system of international run capitalism led by the US, which is, of course, propping up, I would say, Ukraine? I think there's a different power going on there today. But now, getting back to Marx, I mean, he was obviously not right. So Russia was defeated, but it didn't lead to a revolution. It didn't lead to the revival of the European Revolution. Did he, and I don't actually know the answer to this, did he self-criticize? Did he ever regret his view?
Not that I know of. I mean, I've read the book that I put on screen. I've read his just about everything in the collected works about the 1870s, and I've not found anything like that. Marx was endlessly optimistic. I mean, the campaign in Britain that resulted in the 1867 Reform Act, widening the suffrage to a large number of working class men. Marx thought that the demonstrations leading up to that would open the way to revolution. Of course, the result was Disraeli coming back to office. Marx was endlessly optimistic, as far as I can see, in his journalism.
Did he actually support the victory of Turkey, or was he saying that the defeat of Russia would be better than the victory of Russia?
Well, in defeating Russia, you had to have a victory for Turkey, but Turkey was militarily not capable on its own of defeating Russia. It needed its allies, and its allies extracted a price. Its allies were also very exploitative. I mean, in the 1850s, before the Suez Canal, Britain needed an overland route to India, and that was quite important for Britain. We were also increasing our trade with Turkey quite considerably, and profits were rolling in. So we had good reason to support the Turks at that point. Marx had a quite different view, of course. He was focused on revolution, and people like Urquhart were quite shocked when they discovered that he was a revolutionary and not some sort of rather strange conservative.
And in terms of, I mean, there is of course a link between war and revolution. So when your country goes to war, etc., it opens things up. You can, the working class, the people below, often use that opportunity to rebel and to rebel against their leaders. I mean, in terms of today, our working class movement, it isn't usually that we pick sides, isn't it? We don't pick sides between two reactionary forces. We say, coming from Lenin mainly, but surely Marx as well, that the main enemy is at home. So our ruling class, the American ruling class, which runs imperialism, etc., is the main enemy, but we can oppose the other side as well. You say if one side loses, the other side has to win. There's also the possibility of the working classes overthrowing their ruling classes, which sort of happened a little bit in the 1848 in those revolutionary upsurges. it's sort of, was Marx not arguing along those lines that we have to, the working class in Russia has to overthrow its regime as well as the Turkey?
Yeah, the short answer is no. He was arguing alongside the British government and saying the British government need a kick up the arse. They'd better be more vigorous in fighting Russia. They should be better organised. The state of their army was a disgrace. And of course, that was widely acknowledged that even during the war, that the British army and its organisation was dreadful compared with the French, who were much more businesslike, much more organised, and put in a far larger number of forces. So no, Marx in both events was behind, if you like, the ruling class of Britain, and Britain then was the major world power. What he was looking for was the defeat of Russia to open the way to revolution, because of course Russia was the principal power of reaction and seen as a very powerful force. I think the Crimean War showed that it wasn't quite as powerful as it may have been generally thought to be. So no, Marx certainly didn't take that view of that Lenin took in World War One, but I think World War One is an entirely different situation, and we need to think about that very differently from the way that people were thinking about the Crimean War.
Well, thank you for that, comrade. If anybody wants to ask a question or a comment, I suspect there are people of a different view on the Ukraine and Russia war. I mean, as a communist, I don't think we should take sides at all, and I don't see anything more progressive about Ukraine than there's about Russia. In fact, I think they're both enemies of the working class, both regimes. And we'd have to fight in solidarity with working class on both sides to overthrow their regimes rather than picking one side over the other. But of course, there are lefties like you who do support Ukraine, and then there's also support Russia, of course. Let's hear some people then who come in from the audience. Ant.
Hello, Tina. You've said quite a few things that I was wanting to say. So, hopefully today we're not so much at loggerheads. I would also like to say, the first speaker, I thought that his topic was great. I'd have loved to have talked about that, but the two topics actually do intertwine at some point, which hopefully I might get into that. Hopefully, but let's get onto the second one. Okay, I think Marx. It's a very short quote, so I might be able to memorize it perfectly. In the eyes of dialectical philosophy, nothing is established for all time. Nothing is sacred or absolute. So why am I saying that? Because at a certain point in time, one policy is correct, and at another point in time, another policy is correct. So you can't simply say, like, for example, Marx supported Turkey against Russia, or Marx supported Ireland against Britain, against England. It's that, and therefore we can say that today we've got to pick a side. No, that doesn't flow at all. That doesn't flow at all. These are utterly different periods. What Marx was, and I think that Geoff probably got it right. What Marx was trying to do was to advance capitalism, and in the era of Marx and Engels, capitalism was progressive. There was no real chance of establishing global socialism at that point in time. So in Marx's era, capitalism was developing the productive forces, developing the working class. It was progressive compared to non-capitalism, which represented by Russia and its backwardness, its feudalism. But go forward a few decades, and that situation completely changed. And by about World War One, you know, there was no possibility of the working. You know, there was no need for the working class to side with any regime in the world. You know, there was no progressive nationalism anymore. And I think that this is where, you know, the tradition that I defend, you know, the communism that I defend differs from the communism that I think many of the people watching this defends. So, you know, major difference in my tradition, you know, often called the communist left. You know, we often we don't say we are the only communist left. But the idea that there is some sort of a progressive nationalism today, that there is some side that you can, that there is some side that revolutionaries can promote, or hope for the victory of some side, some nationalist outfit, state or otherwise. You know, that is utterly gone. The entire world now, you know, unlike Marx's time, you know, the entire world now is bourgeois. You know, the entire world now is ruled by capitalism. There are no more stages left. You know, and this is where I you know, part company with the for example, the much of what the Communist Party of Great Britain writes. You know, talking about sort of like you know, we've got to, you know, I think probably, you know, the fellow Steve Freeman, you know, who advocates that we have to complete the democratic revolution, or, you know, there is some sort of like a unfinished capitalist business, you know, which is, you know, to me I find that's completely wrong. You know, where we are now, and has been for a long time, is ripe for socialism. Yes, we do not need a intermediate stage between where we are and socialism. Yes, now is the time of revolution. Okay, I think that, you know, what Tina said about, you know, Ukraine and Russia, I thought, oh good, I'm not on my own. Yeah, I'm not on my own. There is no side to defend. There's nothing to choose between. You know, what we're looking at there is a proxy war fought out by, you know, great powers. You know, on the one side, the USA, and you know, it's, well, I don't know if they're its friends anymore. I'm not quite sure what the situation is with the, you know, USA and the Europeans. But you know, let's say on the one side, you know, the USA, you know, the Western powers. On the other side, Russia, and it's being thought out in the Ukraine. There's absolutely nothing for the working class to defend. You know, to hope for the victory or defeat of one side or the other is simply taking sides in imperialist war. But I'm gonna, you know, I think I'm gonna sort of like kick over the ant's nest, or, you know, punch the hornet's nest, in saying the same applies to Palestine. Yeah, anyone who flies a Palestinian flag is flying a bourgeois flag. Is taking sides. Yes, who supports Hamas? You know, Iran. You know, Iran is the godfather of Hamas. You know, to argue that there is some sort of a way forward that involves, you know, siding with the with Hamas, or, you know, fighting against Israel, you know, basically taking sides, yeah, again, is, in my opinion, you know, violating revolutionary internationalism. You know, and to me, that, you know, the slogan par excellence is no war but the class war. You know, the only war that revolutionaries can support is the war of the working class against the bourgeoisie, and that is the opposite of, say, supporting a people against another people. But I think it goes a little bit deeper than this. You know, obviously, as I've mentioned, Marx's argument was that he would side with whatever was progressive for capitalism, against what opposed capitalism, which he saw as reactionary and holding history back. And I think that, it's completely correct in that assessment. But he didn't there was no sort of like arbitrary right to self-determination, or some sort of an abstract right involved. If for example, I believe that Engels refused to support Egyptian nationalists against British imperialism. Yeah. Simply because it was not progressive. There's not it was not something which would help to progress capitalism. But all of that changed with the Second International, who did support this arbitrary right to self-determination, and that the argument was taken up by Rosa Luxemburg, who opposed that idea, and she basically argued, and I think quite correctly, and she's been vindicated, that there is nothing progressive about nationalism whatsoever. It does not lead the working class anywhere but into traps. So I'm going to say that the idea that Geoff came up with, the criteria for supporting one side or another, there are no criteria for supporting one side or another in imperialist war. The only war that a Marxist revolutionary can support today, which is different to in Marx's day, the only war that the Marxist revolution can support today is a class war. The war of the working class globally against the bourgeoisie, which is equally a globalized ruling class. Okay, I think that's all I need to say. No war but the class war is the slogan. No war but the class war. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd say briefly that there is a difference between the violence of the oppressor and the violence of an oppressed population like the Palestinians. Is also entirely different to having two empires fighting it out, which I think what we're seeing in Ukraine, Russia today. The oppression of the Palestinians is another kettle of fish altogether. And sometimes, you support their national liberation struggle, although as communists, we are, of course, against nationalism per se. Geoff, do you want to say something?
I'll say a few things. First of all, Ant's right about one thing, that objectively capitalism's bankrupt. The problem is that subjectively we're in a very different situation. When Ant goes down the pub or back to work in the morning and says, what we need now is a revolution, I get the feeling that most of his workmates and most of the lads down the pub will not be going along with that. That working class consciousness, socialist consciousness, is actually at a very low level. So I think that's vital. And simply turning these ideas into dogmas that you simply utter a phrase, irrespective of the context and the situation, is the mark of the kind of dogmatics that Marx and Engels, and especially Marx, was opposing in his latter days. So I'm concerned about that. Marx was not concerned to advance capital, he was concerned to advance the working class. And of course, after the revolutions of 1848, he used the phrase revolution in permanence. It's in the collected accounts of his writings in 1848. And of course, in his later writings on Russia, he speculated that maybe they didn't need to go through capitalism at all, that the Russian Mir could move on to directly transform itself into a socialized form of society. So Marx was not looking to organize capital. He wasn't Palmerston at all. So I think much of that I disagree with.
Thank you. Agnes, please. Hi. I think
Am
you're.
I muted?
No, we can hear you. Hi.
Oh, so you unmuted me. Okay, all right. Thank you. So, Tina, would I be allowed to make just a few, well, a short comment about the book review?
Of course, comrade.
Okay, all right. And before I thank you for that, and before I do that, I'm not going to say anything about Ukraine except that I disagree with what I just heard now. But I would like to mention that the road from Kiev to Babi Yar, which I'm sure you all know what Babi Yar was. So the road from Kiev to Babi Yar is still named after Bandera. So Diana made some comments about Bandera people in the Ukraine, and in case some people don't know what Babi Yar was, it's like 34,000 Jews were murdered in 1941 by people like Bandera. So that's just like to make this fact known, that the road which leads from Kiev to Babi Yar is still named after him. Okay, so now back to that book review. The author and therefore the presenter mentioned Viktor Orban several times, and it is quite usual in the West to talk about Orban as an example of the far right and the monster and so on. So I closely follow what's going on here in the UK, but also in Hungary. And these days, I find it very hard to see the big difference between what happens in Hungary and what happens in the UK. I mean, for instance, Orban banned all demonstrations, all pro-Palestinian demonstrations. That's it, right at the beginning. You can't demonstrate there. Now here, officially, you can demonstrate, but you may be arrested, you may be called to the police, and so on. So I find that the difference is getting smaller and smaller. The other thing which I'd like to mention, that Orban is no longer the far right in Hungary. There are parties in Hungary which are much more to the right than Orban. And people they keep forgetting that. And yes, Orban is great friends with Trump and Netanyahu, close friendship all round. But he's beginning to be more like a centrist compared to some other really, really, really far-right parties. So I just thought I'd mention that. And thank you for giving me time to make these comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, comrade. I've got Matthew, please.
Hi, comrades. Yeah, thanks to Geoff for that. I won't go into Ukraine because obviously that's a different argument, and I think we should have it somewhere. But I think that, I mean, the basic question is, really in terms of, the approach to the national question and the rest of it, and of course, what we're also looking at really is the development of the working class itself. I mean, as you said, in terms of 1848, what you see obviously is essentially a bourgeois revolution, but with working class, with aspects of the working class. And as he says, posing the question of permanent revolution, of revolution in permanence, that actually, of course, that you start to see the fact that the bourgeoisie will not actually fulfill its own historic tasks because it's afraid. Because it can see this power, and obviously that is then fully expressed, obviously, in the Paris Commune. The first expression of the working class is the Paris Commune, and that clearly causes huge panic. And you see this massive recession, in the world economy. It caused enormous panic on ruling classes all over the place because they can see it. And this is Trotsky, of course. I mean, Trotsky obviously draws this conclusion in 1905. Clearly, the tasks of the ruling class of the bourgeoisie are devolved upon the working class, because it simply won't it will then rather ally itself with medievalism and the old autocracy, you know, as opposed to risking, you know, the working class seizing power. So that's the issue, and it, obviously you will get a series of debates in terms of, you know, debate between Luxemburg and Lenin. And Lenin's recognition, I mean, Lenin's clear recognition that things like the Russian Empire is, as he said, a prison house of nations. And one of his first acts, of course, is to liberate Finland. You know, because he clearly understood that you know, it's down to the Finns to sort. So that, of course, he was then rewarded by the Finns. They went around and massacred the Finnish Communist Party in a civil war, in which, I mean, you know, is still not spoken of, and really nobody's written that much of it. You know, and it, you know, even in terms of, you say, I mean, you know, to say, I mean, Ukraine actually is drawn up as a country by the Bolsheviks. It doesn't exist before, really. You know, as you know, the boundaries, etc., are drawn. They're drawn, you know, at least on the eastern part, is drawn by the Bolsheviks. You know, and in terms of, you know, all this, the issue of the national question, it still exists now. I mean, this is the thing. Okay, we can say that capitalism is rotten and decaying. I mean, we see it in front of us. We can smell it almost. You know, as you know, as in its sort of gangrenous existence, as it thrashes about, killing people. But the national question, in terms of the national oppression of some peoples, is still exists, and we can see it clearly in Palestine. I mean, that's what it is, you know, and therefore, I mean, obviously, you know, as communists, we have to support that struggle for national liberation. And the notion that you wouldn't is ridiculous, completely mad. You know, utterly mad, but understanding at the same time clearly that within that struggle, there's a class question. There's a class question within the Palestinian struggle. You can see it absolutely nakedly if you look at the politics of the likes of the Palestinian Authority, or even the likes of Hamas. You know, I mean, Hamas actually originates as not as the comrade Ant said, actually originates from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. It's the Gaza, originates as the Gaza branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's and you know, it's not even the same. It's you know, Iran is Shia for a start. Gaza is Sunni. It's completely different. You know, so that's where it originates from. And actually, if you look at the history of Hamas, is that as an organization, it was set up with the assistance of the Israeli Shin Bet as a means of splitting the Palestine liberation movement. But the point being is that they've carried out that struggle in terms of you know, the struggle against the Israelis, which has to be supported, which they've done with enormous courage and militarily quite brilliantly. I mean, they defeated the bloody IDF, you know, you know, actually. But the political question then becomes, okay, well, what alternatives posed? And you can quite see this quite clearly, that Hamas then of course supports, you know, rotten crap like what is proposed by Egypt, the Egyptian regime, a filthy and disgusting outfit, or by other organizations, and cannot pose any alternative. You see this, the political deficiency is absolutely clear. I mean, obviously, then, I mean, it's then to work out, you know, what the interest of the working class is in terms of these conflicts. I mean, you can see, I mean, you know, say in Scotland here, some people will pose, large numbers of people in Scotland say, well, there is a national question in Scotland. Scots are oppressed, which is of course bullshit. They're not. Actually, of course, what you have is the you know, the effects of capitalism on the working class in Scotland is quite drastic, dire, but you don't have a national question because Scots are not oppressed as Scots. Not question that. Scotland did a deal to get into the British Empire and did incredibly well. If you ever go through the streets of Glasgow, Edinburgh, you can see it. It's all built there. You know, all that money they sucked out of the British Empire came into these parts. Scotland is an imperialist part of an imperialist country. Ireland, of course, is not. Ireland there is a national question in Ireland, But you get, the question then becomes, I mean, say in the odd wars, the funny wars, like say the conflicts in the South Atlantic 40 years ago, the Falklands Malvinas lark, you have a position in which, both sides are seeking to do down their own working class. The Argentine regime was clearly in the process of saying, well, we'll have a war, so we can maintain ourselves as a military regime, and then obviously cut the throat of the working class. That was nakedly their aim. And the same for Thatcher. But the point really then in those terms is that both the working class of both sides should oppose their own bloody ruling classes. Is the thing in those terms. And it's then to say, okay, well, can we work out, in terms of what actually is the interest of the working class, which primarily, usually means opposing your own ruling class at war, and particularly, obviously, Ukraine. Because obviously that's a proxy war being put together by the US, originally, of course, by the US and Germany, supported, by the British, who were just crazy, complete lunatics, and clearly want a nuclear war and would kill us all. These people are mad, they're just completely mad. But yeah, the working class should oppose its own ruling class in war, no question. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Geoff, do you want to reply anything to that?
Very briefly, a couple of things. Marx certainly didn't take the view that you inevitably oppose your own ruling class in the 1850s and in the 1870s. Secondly, I worry about this word proxy. A good alternative word is puppet. That the people of Ukraine aren't real people at all. They're merely puppets to be moved about, or pawns to be moved about on the imperialists' board. I reject that. I think Marx made the point that the working class speaks for itself, and that people speak for themselves. We hear about the Maidan event as the Americans paid people to simply go there and demonstrate. Well, lots of poor people would accept money to go along on a coach and have a little day out and go home. But that wasn't what happened. They stayed there through freezing temperatures, day after day, night after night. Now, whether they were partially paid for by capital, with the Russians paying for the other side or not, I don't know. They probably were. But they stayed there because they wanted to, and because they wanted to reject the existing regime. And to denounce ordinary people as a load of proxies and puppets, and only we, the elite, know better, is frankly disgraceful. By the way, if the US changes sides and supports Russia against Ukraine, does everybody here suddenly support Ukraine against Russia?
I wouldn't. Not sure if you asked. I don't. Well, I think the regime in Ukraine is different from the working class in a regime. The working class of Ukraine is certainly suffering. It is a victim. It's the biggest victim in this war for sure. But they have been totally depoliticized as well, haven't they? They have no possibility to make themselves heard. This is Zelensky doing it with the corporation, well, the previous government of the US. It's now been laid ad absurdum by Trump just changing sides, really showing how ridiculous this war really is. It's not my turn to speak. The people want to come in. Owen, please.
Thanks. I'm pleasantly surprised that I joined in for a conversation about the Ottoman Empire, which I know nothing about. So it's pleasantly surprising that there are things I can contribute on. But yeah, I kind of wanted to respond to a few bits of the conversation. I think partly I'm responding to what Ant was saying earlier about nationalisms and Marx and Engels' method. I think there's a bit of I think when people are discussing the approach that Marx and Engels took to interstate international conflicts in the 19th century, we sometimes act as if they were immune from making mistakes. But I think, as Geoff mentioned in the introductory comments in passing, I think, especially in this period, Marx and Engels' approach to this issue was actually left quite a lot to be desired, and I think would later implicitly, as Geoff also mentioned, be corrected. When Marx and Engels were writing about the European Revolution in like the 1840s and I think into the early 1850s, they had views on, I mean, especially Engels wrote comments about Slavs which read now as frankly genocidal, and at the same time, there were also, like, Engels was also very sympathetic to the American war against Mexico, which was basically, we understand now, is basically a slave owners' war. They'd adopted, they hadn't fully articulated the standpoint that they ultimately would, which is an independent standpoint of the working class. And I think this is why, in these regards, Marx and Engels' writings from the end of their lives are often more valuable than the writings that they were producing in the 1840s and the start of the 1850s. By the end of their lives, again, as Geoff mentioned earlier, they had a very much more flexible understanding of where the revolution against capitalism was going to come from and where the major points of vulnerability were in the capitalist system. In the course of the 1850s, Marx went from being broadly sympathetic to British imperialism in India to championing the what was basically the opening act of the Indian nationalist struggle, the revolt of 1856, because he recognised that regardless of the fact that there wasn't really much of an industrial working class in colonial India, that constituted a rebellion which would have profoundly weakened the British Empire and would have provided an immense opportunity for the British working class to institute their own socialistic revolution in Britain. And I think that's just one of many, many examples of Marx and other great Marxists championing nationalist struggles in contexts where they recognize that a nationalist struggle is also itself a class struggle and helps to accelerate the class struggle. And I think this is, one of the mistakes that I've seen what Ant was saying and seeking then to apply to Palestine. I think that there's a mechanical counterposing of nationalist and class struggles, which makes very little sense. In Palestine, for instance, the major struggle is precisely about land and the forcible dispossession of people from their land, as well as about an apartheid regime which deprives people of equal access and fair access to jobs and wages. Rates of unemployment among Palestinians are astronomical, especially in Gaza. And in that context, the nationalist struggle really is not separable from a class struggle, even if at the same time you recognize that there is such a thing as a Palestinian capitalist class, which ought not to be counted on. I also incidentally object to the notion that the Palestinian capitalist class is the same in the Palestinian Authority as it is in Hamas. I think that Hamas are a quite different formation, and not one that we ought to uncritically support, but they're a very different formation that are playing a completely different role in the area than the Palestinian Authority are. And in all of these regards, I think there is actually an opportune day to be having this conversation, because I think it was published today. There's a new book by Kevin Anderson that's been published by Verso today called Late Marx's Revolutionary Roads, that elaborates on on the basis of a detailed study of Marx's late writings and notes on indigenous people and on colonial and pre-colonial societies, develops a much clearer understanding, I think, of what Marx ultimately came to understand as the relationship between revolutionary movements in the imperial center and movements outside of it. And I think that ultimately the standpoint that he developed and the methodology that he developed, and I think this also finally comes around to the question of Russia and Ukraine, is one which emphasizes not the fate of the European revolution principally, but takes the starting point that capitalism is a system that has a totalizing effect across the world, that connects places across the world, and where the struggle for socialism is completely interdependent around the world. And so our starting point has to be not a nationalist starting point, obviously, but also not even a European starting point, but a global starting point. And in that context, I don't think that Geoff's position in defense of Ukraine is really defensible, because in a global setting, it's quite clear that Ukraine represents a front in a NATO struggle and a US-led struggle, although obviously the US is abdicating its responsibility there. Nevertheless, it represents a front in a NATO-led struggle to reassert American dominance on the world stage, and that's not that's not a struggle that should be uncritically supported. I think it's difficult to articulate an opposition to NATO in Ukraine at the same time as we recognize and respect Ukrainian people's right to self-determination. But nevertheless, that is the kind of the needle that we need to thread. And I think by simply stating that we ought to be backing Ukraine without recognizing the fact that Ukrainian resistance and the whole Ukrainian war is extremely reliant on and motivated in large part by NATO. I think that's abandoning a class independent position, and I think it's also abandoning Marx's ultimate methodology and starting point, which was understanding global dynamics, and that I think should be our starting point as well.
Very good, Owen. I wonder if you want to come back at some stage and address a session of ours. I think you'd have a lot to say. That book sounds interesting, actually. So if you fancy a review or something, that would be an idea, or anything else. I'll write to you. Okay, thank you. Geoff, do you want to reply to something? Very
briefly, Owen is much more reasonable than some of the comments in the chat, which seem to think that all parties are banned in Ukraine, and that the concentration camps have destroyed and murdered every trade unionist. They seem to entirely defy the actual evidence of people living there. My concern in Ukraine would be to back the working class movement. Now, that is problematic. I agree. Israel is actually worse than apartheid. Much worse. In apartheid, the idea was you locked these people away and brought them back to work when you wanted them. Israel has entirely different intentions with the Palestinians, which are much more like the intentions of the United States and the Native Americans or the Australians and their native population. It's destruction of those people. And one of the interesting points was that when the hostages were taken, a good number of them were South Asian hostages. They were brought in to substitute for Arab labor in order to move the way to the destruction of those people. Now, we do not support genocide, and simply trotting out phrases about no war but the class war does not deal with the horror of that situation. If we're not concerned with human oppression, what the hell are we here for?
Thank you, Geoff. Rob, please.
Hi, Tina. Hi, Geoff. Hi, everybody. So I'm glad Owen came in, because I was running quite hot. I think before then I was about to go off on one, but Owen was very reasonable and measured and calmed me down. I think coming into the session, I was kind of expecting to hear a little bit more about the Crimean War itself, and obviously, it's an imperialist war. It's a conflict between the rising Russian state, as Geoff rightly pointed out, and the Allied powers around the Ottomans. I think boiling it down to Ottomans versus Russia and allies is actually, again, simplistic. It's, Britain had a vested interest in keeping the Black Sea free from Russian influence, so it could continue its empire trade across the Black Sea. It was running trade through the Bosphorus Straits all through its existence. And also, again, I think there was a bit of a lack of the details of the Crimean War, because it was a great travesty for the working class and for the soldiers who died in the Crimean War. And, it wasn't a small casualty rate. The Battle of Baklava particularly was a horrific period in human history. There's a lot about that war that is kind of instrumental in the way that wars were fought going on. There was battles in that war where the ruling class, the aristocracy, were having literal tea parties watching the slaughter of the ordinary soldier from the top of the hill. The Russian generals and the French generals and the British generals sitting down watching a set piece fight that they organized, in which people were losing their lives. All for the geopolitical rivalries between these two nations. Well, 3 nations, 4 nations. So I think that was a little bit of analysis that I think could have been there. I'm not sure. Again, I haven't read the Marx letters, but I've read Capital, and I've read a lot of his other works. I feel like Marx would have mentioned that at some point, surely. But that brings us on to, what I was expecting to kind of see a bit more of was the parallels between the access to the Crimea and the access to Ukraine that Russia still drives for today. It still needs that warm water port. It still wants that geopolitical control of the Black Sea. It's the same battle being fought, 200 years later. And it shows you how imperialistic modern states are and hawkish in that way. We're still looking at the saber rattling between the two of them. Only now the sabers are, thousands of nuclear tipped missiles. They could drive us to global extinction, especially in that conflict today. It's again, to take sides is to push one side against another. I mean, do we stay supporting Ukraine, Geoff, if that's going to mean further British involvement, further American involvement, further war against Russia, direct war against Russia? And what does that look like? What does that look like for the proletariat? Every drop of blood that is spilled by the proletariat in defense of an arbitrary border created by the bourgeois imperialist class is a crime. And that's the way we have to look at war. We're pacifists. We've got to be pacifists. Apart from, like, as Ant actually said correctly, the only real war is the class war. However, I disagree strongly on Palestine, really, really strongly on Palestine, because that's a genocide. That's the slaughtering of people, innocent people. That's our comrades' blood being spilled. That's that's the future, the children that could be socialist tomorrow being slaughtered over there, and we shouldn't stay out of it. I don't know if Ant's communism would mean that ultimately we become so detached from the world that we go into space and set up some kind of lunar communist colony, because that's what it's sounding like. We're not here to remove ourselves from the situation. We've got to fight, and we've got to fight for the lives of every working class person in the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Anything you want to reply, Geoff?
Nope.
Nope. I'll bring in...
Give other people a chance.
Yes. William wants to speak. Hi.
Am I unmuted? I am.
You certainly are.
Thank you. Right. I did visit the Crimea, and I visited the sites of the Crimean War. And I found one of them quite amusing because it was where the so-called glorious Battle of the Charge of the Light Brigade took place. And I had a look at all the names of those who had deceased in that battle. I wanted to see was there an O'Brien among them, and because O'Brien is the second biggest name in Ireland. And I was very, very pleased that there wasn't. There was two Kyo's, which was my brother's name, and they were involved in the two. I asked the guide what their interpretation of the battle was. And he said it was, they were all lined up and they were told to draw their swords. And there was a young cadet behind the leader of the British group that has never been a battle before, drew a sword and stuck his sword up the arse of the horse of the leader. He ran forward, and the rest of them ran forward, and the horses started galloping. And then the Russians started using their cannons. And he said that was an absolute mess. So the British military had to glorify that by saying what a glorious war it was. And then they got your man, the writer's poem, into the Valley of Death, and the gallant 700 or 800 everywhere. For them was not the reason why, for them was just a do and die. And that was a way of dealing with it back in England in the press. Now, at that time, Marx, who had a very serious drink problem, went to the local pub, reading the stuff in the paper. An Englishman asked him, a proletariat Englishman, what happens out in Crimea? and he told him, and he read it, and he said, Marx said it was a terrible waste of life. And the Englishman told him, the proletariat Englishman, look at you, mate, I know you're a foreigner by your accent, right? I'm a John Bull Englishman, and that's what I am, and that's what I be. They were our boys. And that's the mentality of the British working class, as far as Ireland is concerned. And it's backward and it's reactionary. And that has to be faced up to. Now, there was other glorifications of the war. That, first of all, yeah, and as for bringing it into the modern day and trying to claim that Ukraine is some kind of a glorious battle for freedom against the Russians, is a complete and absolute nonsense. What you had, first of all, one of the speakers there said that Ukraine wasn't there at that time. It wasn't. The Crimea War was fought between Russia and Britain. Crimea was a small central place in.
Actually, in my new book, I trace the origins of this system. I go back really to the beginning.
Why am I being interrupted?
Sorry, there was some microphone open. All good. Carry on.
Right, now, Ukraine was a part of what is now modern day Ukraine. In the central part of that, there was an area known as Ukraine. Ukraine was set up in 1921 by Stalin. Stalin was the director of the nationalities, and his committee set up Ukraine, as it did all the other socialist republics. He brought the recommendations to the Politburo, and the Politburo agreed it, and it was stamped by Lenin, who was in charge of the Politburo. And when Putin said at the beginning of this current war that Lenin set up Ukraine, that's what he was talking about. He was actually talking about the decision made by the Committee on Nationalities that Stalin was in charge of. That was that. Now, the Ukraine itself was mostly, at the time, part of the Polish Empire. We have a woman called Countess Markievicz, who is famous in our history. She was actually the first woman elected to the British House of Commons, and she was called a countess because she married a Polish count. Where was his estate? His estate was 25 miles to the east of Kiev, which is moving towards the Donbass. And he was a Polish count. He got his part of the Polish Empire. Now, this thing about Zelensky being a Democrat, and this is why I have to reject everything that Geoff has to say. It's totally and absolutely untrue. Right? Zelensky is a fascist. He's supported by fascists, the Banderites, and he has banned all other expressions that don't coincide with his view on things. He has banned trade unions. He has incorporated the Azov battalion and the rights sector into the Ukrainian army. Now, as for the Russian intervention, and it wasn't an invasion, it was an intervention. And it was a very necessary intervention. And if anything, it has to be condemned for not going in quicker. There was 14,000 people killed from 2014 up to when Putin made his intervention. And it was fair play to Putin for making his intervention. And he was supported by the communists and by left-wing progressives, both in the Donbass, the Luhansk, and in Russia itself. And it was the pressure put on by the Russian working class that made him take action to defend the Russian-speaking people of this artificial country called Ukraine. Now, there's no question of it that Ukraine is going to be partitioned. There is an element of it's a proxy war between NATO and Western capitalism versus Eastern capitalism. Yes, you can argue that, but the working class in Luhansk and in Donbass support in the millions. 4 million of them left Donbass and went to live in Russia. They didn't come here to live in Ireland or Britain. They went to live in Russia, and they are now part of the labour force in there. If you have a look at the city of Mariupol, which was that's the only city the Russians had to destroy. They didn't destroy the other cities. They surrounded them, and they took off the Nazis bit by bit, and they're winning. And they're winning, and it's for progress. And Mariupol has now been rebuilt. I have very strong connections with the communities, Ukrainian communities in Ireland, that have been told by the Irish state they have to support Zelensky. When you get to know them and they speak privately, and you're talking to them and socialize with them, they tell you a completely different narrative. So I don't know where Geoff gets his information from, but as far as I'm concerned, it's off the wall.
Thanks, William. And wants to come back in briefly. I suggest we let him, and then we can go back to Geoff for summing up. Sorry, you have to unmute. Still muted.
Yes, I think that's it. Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Couple of things. Yes, couple of things. Yeah, obviously, I stand by what I said regarding, the Palestine situation. Okay. Now, no one's saying that horrific things aren't being done to the Palestinian working class. They are. It looks to me like they're going to get rid of them by the looks of it. As far as I can understand, to my understanding, they're either exterminated or just simply shipped away somewhere. That seems to be their fate. Yeah, so it's a horrific thing that's being done to them. Nobody's denying that. That's not the point. That's not the point. The point is what can be done about it. Yes, and the idea of Hamas, sending the Palestinian proletariat to fight U.S. imperialism, because that's what it comes down to, doesn't it? What is Israel but a bastion of U.S. imperialism? So Hamas is going to send out the Palestinian proletariat to fight U.S. imperialism, and you're all going to say, if I was there, I would be bearing arms and joining them. And to me, okay, let's just imagine, and I don't believe this at all. Let's just imagine that was the right thing to do. It seems to me that is simply going to result in further extermination and a spiral of bloodshed. But I don't believe that's the thing to do. I don't believe that the solution to imperialist war is ever going to be take a side. It's always going to be, the main enemy is at home. The main enemy is the Israeli ruling class. The main enemy is Hamas. All of these bourgeois entities are our enemies. Yes, and I'm. You've said that Hamas is definitively not funded by. Well, you are not in the chat anyway. In the chat, sorry, I have to be more precise. Sorry. People said that Hamas is not funded by Iran. I've given you a link to an article which says it is. So So I don't think we're going to settle that in 5 minutes here, today. But I think that's something that we could look into, and we can bring proof to that. And if you think about what is Iran, so I'm saying that Iran is funding Hamas. Iran is part of BRICS. BRICS is dominated by China. Can you not see that this is yet further vindication of what Rosa Luxemburg said? Yes. And what did Rosa Luxemburg say? national liberation is impossible. You cannot simply opt out of imperialism. There is, people saying, oh, this nation became free. Yeah, and then what did it have to do? It had to join an opposing imperialist bloc. What happened to Cuba, for example? Yeah, Cuba, there was never a communist revolution in Cuba. It never. No way did the working class take power in Cuba. All there was a nationalist breakaway from the United States. Yes, Castro was no communist. Yes, but what did he have to do? What did he have to do when he left one imperialist bloc? He had to find another one. There is no independence for these backward countries. It's impossible to stand independent of imperialism. Imperialism doesn't work like that. Imperialism is a division of the world between the great powers. Yes, they will not allow areas of the world to stand outside of that relationship. Yes, what I'm saying to you is that Palestine is part of an imperialist clash between China and the USA. And how is it conducted? Yes, well, the tentacles, if the funders of Hamas, which I'm saying are Iran, yes, and whoever else, it doesn't matter, Hamas is being funded, yes, by certain entities. I'm going to say Iran, yes, and those entities are entwined in another. Those entities have their imperialist masters, yes, and the whole thing comes down to China and the USA. And you are saying, yes, because of the atrocities committed against the Palestinians, which nobody's denying, the atrocities are real, the horrors are real, the horrors are real, yes. You are saying that the solution is for the Palestinian proletariat led by Hamas to go to war against US imperialism. And I'm saying the only solution is to organize revolution globally. That's it. There is no stages, no democratic stages, nothing, no the solution. That is the only solution. You're saying that dogma. But I'm saying your dogma is that there's a different solution. There's a capitalist solution, and there isn't. There is no capitalist solution to imperialist war. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and okay, Geoff. Summing up, I think Owen made a really good point. Sometimes Marx and Engels were wrong, and they were probably wrong on that issue. So, but
which is what I was saying, of course.
Yes.
I'll start. Last shall be first. Ant is a model of what we really shouldn't be. It's not a question of the Palestinian working class. It's a question of the entire people. The attempt is to destroy that people. Marx starts off with human beings, not abstractions. I'm afraid Ant lives in a world of his own. I would suggest trying this on tomorrow at work. And I think that is always a good test. He'll talk a completely different language to his mates at work. A few words about, I think I heard some very interesting discussion about the 1850s and 70s, and I'll certainly be reviewing some of that material. I don't have any perfect answers, unfortunately. As to Ukraine, I would simply say, let's have a sense of proportion. It's not a Nazi state. It contains Nazis, but so does Russia. And Putin's connection with Nazis is also something that people here, many of them, don't seem to want to explore for some reason. I'm not sure why. And the notion that the remnants of a Stalinist Communist Party are somehow the people who should guide us in this are absurd. The left in Russia, as I know, to the left of the formal communist parties, opposes the invasion. So I think we need to work with the working class movements in these countries. They may not be enormously strong. They may disagree with each other. I mean, why not? but that's where we should be going. The idea that these are mere puppets to be moved around is to deny entirely Marx's theses on Feuerbach. And I think comrades should have another look at what they mean. Yes, they were very early in Marx's life, and he certainly revised his political opinions for the better as time went on, as has been pointed out. But that basic humanity must shine through. Once we see people as mere puppets doing as they're told without any reflection, we have destroyed the fundamental insight of Marx. We've destroyed the fundamental basis of working class revolution, frankly. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Interesting session, although we did divert to Ukraine, but that's no harm to bring it down to today's situation. Next week, we're going to start a 2-week session on the SPD. Well, it's two separate sessions, actually, with 2 different speakers, but both will be looking at the German Social Democratic Party. If you don't know very much about it, it was perhaps the only real working class mass party so far. The first one, let's put it like that. Bolsheviks took a lot of inspiration from the German SPD. Of course, that was before it changed into what it is now, a pro-imperialist, pro-capitalist party. So we're starting next week looking at how did the SPD manage to become a mass party with Andrew Bonnell, and then looking at German social democracy, a model for the Bolsheviks. Hope to see you there. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, comrades.